Good afternoon, everyone. I am John Torres, and I am the assigned reporter for this chapter, which is entitled Scope Planning. We all know that planning is very important in everything that we are doing, most especially when we are doing projects, because planning will help our projects achievable. And aside from that, planning will help to make a directions of our projects. So, scope planning refers to a project management process that defines boundaries and deliverables. The planning category covers descriptions on deliverables, the program charters, constraints, and assumptions. As an initiator of the project, you always wanted to know what work has to be done before you start it. For instance, as the team leader of the project, you are collecting a team members, and you need to know what they are going to do to meet the project's objectives. So, like what I've said earlier, that planning is important, or this will help you to have a clear path in achieving the goals or in achieving the objectives, because the planning process will help you to have a guide in doing the projects correctly and appropriately. It also says here that project scope planning is concerned with the definitions of all the work needed to successfully meet the project objectives. So here, the whole idea is that when you're starting doing a project, you need to have a clear pictures of all the work that needs to happen on your projects, because as the project progresses, you need to keep the scope up to date and written down in the project scope management plan. So that is the significance of scope planning and doing a project. And now let us continue the discussion by defining the scope. So you already have a head start on refining the project's objectives and quantifiable terms, right? But now you need to plan further and write down all the intermediate and final deliverables that you and your team will produce over the course of the project. But before anything else, what is deliverables? When we say deliverables, this includes everything that you and your team produce for the projects. For instance, deliverables is anything that your projects will deliver. So that is the meaning of deliverables. Furthermore, the deliverables of your project include all the products or services that you and your team are performing for the client, customer, or sponsor. They include every intermediate document, plan, schedule, budget, blueprint, and anything else that will be made along the way, including all the project management documents that you put together. And aside from that, project deliverables are the tangible outcomes. It is also measurable in terms of results or specific items that must be produced to consider either the project or the project phase completed. All deliverables must be described in a sufficient level of details so that they can be differentiated from related deliverables. And for you to be able to understand it, we have given examples here. For instance, we have a twin engine plane versus a single engine plane. So as you can notice here, although they are the same engine plane, but in terms of quantity, they are different because we have twin engine plane versus a single engine plane. Next example is that a red marker versus a green marker. Although they are the same marker, but in terms of color, they are different because we have red and we have green. Next is a daily report versus a weekly report. Although they are report, but they are different in terms of schedule. Let's say a schedule of conducting the report. We have daily and we have weekly. And lastly, a departmental solution versus an enterprise solution. So as you can see, or as you can notice here, it says that it should have a sufficient levels of details, although they are related deliverables, but it needs to have a detail so that it can be differentiated from one another. Next is project requirements. After all the deliverables are identified, the project manager needs to document all the requirements of the project. Requirements describes the characteristics of the final deliverable, whether it is a product or a service. They describe the required functionality that the final deliverable must have or specific conditions the final deliverable must meet in order to satisfy the objectives of the project. So here, the project requirements needs to become specific and more clear and detailed, and aside from that, it should describe the functionality or what are the functions of the final deliverable of the final product or service in order to satisfy the objectives of the project. A requirement is an objective that must be met. The project requirements defined in the scope plan describe what a project is supposed to accomplish and how the project is supposed to be created and implemented. So here, a requirement is very important because without meeting all the necessary requirements prior to the establishing the project, you will not be able to achieve the goal of the project. So you need to be mindful and you need to be considerate in terms of the requirements in your project. Moreover, requirements answer the following questions regarding the SEs and to be states of the business, like who, what, where, when, how much, and how does a business process work. This WH questions is beneficial in your project. Requirements may include attributes like dimensions, ease of use, color, specific ingredients, and so on. If we go back to the example of the company producing holiday eggnog, one of the major deliverables is the cartons that hold the eggnog. The requirements for that deliverable may include carton design, photographs that will appear on the carton, color choices, and etc. So in the given example, requirements specify what the final project deliverable should look like and what it should do. Requirements must be measurable, testable, related to identify business needs or opportunities, and defined to a level of detail sufficient for a system design. So like what I've said earlier in the given example in the former part of my discussion, I gave an example which is the deliverables is detailed and has a sufficient descriptions in order for the examples become differentiated. So like here, so it should have a clear and detailed sufficient descriptions in all the deliverables. They can be divided into 6 basic categories such as functional, non-functional, technical, business, user, and regulatory requirements. Now let's proceed to the first category, which is the functional requirements. Functional requirements describe the characteristics of the final deliverable in ordinary, non-technical language. They should be understandable to the customers, and the customers should play a direct role in their development. Functional requirements are what you want the deliverable to do. For instance, if you were buying vehicles for a business, your functional requirement might be the vehicle should be able to take up to a 1-ton load from your warehouse to a shop. Let's give an example. Let's say you have a business of heavy products like gravels, metals, or glass, and enable for you to transport the products to your customers, you need to have, of course, a vehicle. And a functional requirement of this, the vehicle should have the capacity to transport heavier products and take up to a 1-ton load from a warehouse to your customer. So that is the meaning of functional requirements. So what are the functional requirements of the vehicles that you need? And now let's proceed to non-functional requirements. When we say non-functional requirements, these are the requirements specify criteria that can be used to judge the final product or service that your project delivers. Non-functional requirements are the restrictions or constraints to be placed on the deliverable and how to build it. The purpose of non-functional requirements is to restrict the numbers of solutions that will meet a set of requirements. Using a vehicle example, the functional requirement is for a vehicle to take a load from a warehouse to a shop. Without any constraints, the solutions being offered might result in anything from a small to a large truck. So non-functional requirements can be split into 2 types. We have performance and development. In a given example vehicle, to restrict the types of solutions, you might include these performance constraints. So here are the constraints that you need to consider in buying your vehicles or truck. So the purchased truck should be American-made truck due to the government incentives. So due to the government incentives, you have to consider that the truck should be made American. Next is the load area must be covered. The load area must have the height of at least 10 feet. So here are the constraints that you need to consider in buying first your vehicle truck. One of the important points of this example is that they restrict the number of solution options that are offered to you by the developer. In addition to the performance constraints, you may include some development constraints. There are three general types of non-functional development constraints. The first one is time. When we say time, it is when a deliverable should be delivered. Next is resource. Resource is how much money is available to develop the deliverable. And last is quality. Quality is any standards that are used to develop the deliverable, development methods, and etc. Now let's proceed to technical requirements. Technical requirements emerge from the functional requirements to answer the questions: how will the problem be solved this time? And will it be solved technologically and or procedurally? They specify how the system needs to be designed and implemented to provide required functionality and fulfill required operational characteristics. An example of technical requirements is that an application be written in Java or must run on the XYZ computer. Whenever you have a requirement based purely on technology, try to determine the real underlying business needs being expressed. To do this, keeping asking why your application must meet a requirement. This is one of the example of technical requirements. Next is business requirements. Business requirements are the needs of the sponsoring organization, always from the management perspective. Business requirements are the statement of the business rationale for the project. They are usually expressed in broad outcomes, satisfying the business needs rather than specific functions the system must perform. These requirements grow out of the visions for the product that in turn is driven by the mission or business goals and objectives. The focus of business requirements are for the growth of the vision of the product or service that you are trying to render or that you are trying to provide for the customers or the people. And aside from that, what is the business rationale for doing this such project? So that is the meaning of business requirements. Next is user requirements. User requirements describe what the user needs to do with the system or product. The focus is on the user experience with the system under all scenarios. These requirements are the input for the next development phases. Under interface design and system test cases design, the focus of user requirements is on the user itself. The focus is that the things that the user, what are the needs that they do in the system or product, and at the same time to the experience in the system under all scenarios. All the experience of the users will be beneficial to the next project or the next development phases in the project. So that is the importance of user requirements for doing the projects. Now we have regulatory requirements. Regulatory requirements can be internal or external and are usually non-negotiable. They are the restrictions, licenses, and laws applicable to a product or service or the business that are imposed by the government. Regulatory requirements, from the word itself regulatory, we have the regulations, the rules and regulations that are imposed by the government that somehow will restrict the operations of the business. Because as we know, government has intervention in every business established in the market. So we have the rules and regulations, the restrictions. Here are the laws applicable to your product or business. That is the meaning of regulatory requirements. An example of requirements: automated teller machine or ATMs can be used to illustrate a wide range of requirements. What are the some physical features of these machines? And what kinds of functions do they perform for the bank's customers? Why did banks put this system in place? And what are the high-level business requirements? We have ATM functional requirements and ATM non-functional requirements. When we say ATM functional requirements, the system will enable the user to select whether or not to produce a hard copy transaction receipt before completing a transaction. While when we say ATM non-functional requirements, all display will be in white, 14-point Arial text on black background. While in terms of technical requirements, the ATM system will connect seamlessly to the existing customers' databases. Concerning to a user requirements, the system will completely a standard withdrawal from a personal account from login to cash in less than 2 minutes. And concerning the ATM business requirements, by providing superior service to our retail customers, Monumental Bank's ATM network will allow us to increase associated service fee revenue by 10% annually on an ongoing basis. And lastly, concerning with ATM regulatory requirements, all ATMs will connect to a standard utility power sources within their civic jurisdictions and be supplied with an uninterrupted power source approved by the company. And to the last part of my discussion, we have software requirements fundamentals. This section refers to requirements of software because it is concerned with the problems to be addressed by software. A software requirements is a property that must be exhibited by software developed or adapted to solve a particular problem. For instance, we have a verifications that throughout requirements on a call center may necessary the development of simulation software. Both the software requirements and software quality personnel must ensure that the requirements can be verified within the available resources constraints. Another common examples includes a priority rating to enable trade-offs in the face of the finite resources and a status value to enable project progress to be monitored. Typically, software requirements are uniquely identified so that they can be monitored over the entire software life cycle. That is the end of my discussion. Thank you for listening.